Hey, Chirag, so you've partnered with governments of A-plus countries to grow their startup ecosystems, which is very impressive, if I may add. Now, from this experience, what have you observed over the years? If you could break down some observations for us.
I think there are three massive observations or learnings I had in the process. First key learning is what works for certain countries. And before I share that, the first learning, very often all the countries ask for the best practices in the benchmarks. Unfortunately, the best practices in benchmarks don't work for different countries. So if you take what has worked for Singapore and you try to replicate that in Saudi Arabia, for example, or Ghana, for example, it's very unlikely it's going to work. What might have worked in Singapore may have worked primarily because there were certain other factors in place that have supported the overall ecosystem and helped it thrive. So that's the learning number one. Learning number two has been what has worked in the past. Probably in 2015, let's say you came up with certain framework in UAE that gave excellent results. What worked in the past may or may not work again. So a similar grant, similar framework, similar policies may lead to totally different impact because all the other countries or the other variables are changing very fast right now. So that's a learning number two. Learning number three is that there is no one right formula. So it's a trial and error method. It's running a startup ecosystem itself is a startup. So just like a startup which is iterating, pivoting, and learning and changing, you need to be very agile on how you are developing, nurturing, and managing the startup ecosystem. If you're not agile enough, then the likelihood is that you're going to fail. So just wanted to make sure that we got it right. You cannot copy the benchmarks. You cannot replicate your past, and you have to be agile.
That I think these are very good points because it seems to be a logical approach to want to replicate what has worked in other countries. And I myself, I look at other countries like, as you mentioned, Singapore, even India, where you're focused on right now, and seeing these various growth and thinking, okay, well, what could be taken from here? Dubai is another example that could be utilized in various African countries, which is what I'm focused on personally. Now, what have you seen that led you to this belief with that first observation that it can't be replicated? If you want to go into more details on that.
Sure, absolutely. So I'll share an example of one of the projects that we were delivering in a government setting in the Middle East. I'll not share the name of the country for sensitivity, but the idea was very similar. They wanted to nurture the startup ecosystem and they wanted to push and promote the startup ecosystem. The first thing that they did was, when they wanted to do that, they asked for a tender from all the management or strategy consulting firms. McKinsey, BCG, PwC, Strategy, and all the firms in the region, they asked for tender. And one of the requirements for them was that you must have had worked in Singapore, in London, in Tokyo, and some other Berlin. So those were the requirements. But now, if you think of it, Berlin's ecosystem thrived primarily because Berlin has been known for engineering talent. So that's why all the frameworks and policies were only a very small subset of the overall ecosystem. Singapore's ecosystem thrived because Singapore has a local population which is highly educated and very rigorous. Singapore has two universities, NUS and NTU. Both are rated internationally in the top 100 universities in the world. So they are breeding talent, in-house talent so much. It's a very different ball game for Singapore. You mentioned India. India has abundant number of engineers, more engineers than Indian companies can absorb. and extremely high quality engineers that you can think of. You talk about London, the same challenge. London has a huge corporate. The people in London have a strong backing of the corporates. They have learned so much from corporates. These are the guys who came from banking and consulting and technology, and because these in consulting, banking, or technology gives them experiences across nations. So even before the frameworks came in by the governments, they were already a talent was already breeding. So frameworks only supported them. Now in this country that wanted to adopt the benchmark frameworks or policies or regulations by rest of the world, it just cannot work. You have not been breeding talent. You have not been breeding industries. Then how can you suddenly imagine do you imagine the highly capable people who are brain drained to New York or London or Berlin or Singapore or Dubai? They will leave that and come back to the home country or come to your country as an expat to start a startup ecosystem or be part of that. Unless you pay them a lot of money, yes, that might actually happen. But if that is not happening, the chances of that happening is slim. That is one. The second thing that we also need to understand is that a lot of countries that are thriving startup ecosystem have a strong local demand for technology or the outputs that are generated from technology. Singapore has a strong demand. Everyone, even the kids, are buying everything online. You go to London, there's a strong demand in the ecosystem. If you are in some of the Middle Eastern countries, there's no the ways of working are still old school in some of the countries, not all of them. It's still very old school. And because it is old school, you just cannot expect, even if a startup comes up with a amazingly beautiful Tesla, for example, there will be no buyers because they are very comfortable driving Rolls Royce because that's the symbol of class for them. So there is there has to be a demand factor as well. There is a societal factor as well, and there are multiple factors which makes the startup ecosystem successful. You just cannot copy and paste the frameworks and regulations.
Okay, no, that makes a ton of sense. How then have you seen successful governments go about influencing demand, right? Because all this, it seems like a top-down approach. When the government is involved and they're influencing certain things, then it seems like the people follow and they pick up where the government left off. So how have you seen government influence this, especially in India? Because again, I know you're focused on India right now, and your fund at 8X Ventures. Your thesis is for that region as well. So can you give us some examples?
I'll give you two examples. First is from the UAE and second is from India. So let's talk about UAE. I am personally a big fan of UAE government for multiple reasons, but let's talk about the crypto policies and the startups around crypto ecosystem. UAE spotted a massive opportunity that a lot of Asian countries are not comfortable with crypto right now. Almost everyone right now agrees that blockchain and crypto are the ways of the future. The Web3, and some people have started looking out for, Jen Dorsey is talking about Web5 now. The Web3 and Web5 hinges upon, a big part of that hinges upon metaverse, blockchain, uh, NFTs, crypto. Now, in Asia, there has been a low acceptance from the policies and regulation standpoint. What did UAE do? UAE spotted that as an opportunity, and they came up with a regulation, and they came up with the proper frameworks, guidelines, and processes on how the crypto startups can work, how blockchain startups can work, and they encouraged the funds or the startup accelerators from the region to come here and set it up, and we will support you with in terms of policies and framework. And they were also great because they were listening. They were listening very carefully. to what do startups have to say, what do the venture builders have to say, what do corporates have to say. And because they were listening, they have been adapting very, very fast. And if you start to notice, a lot of startups, and not some, a lot of startups have actually moved their bases from Asia, different parts of Asia, to UAE, especially Dubai. And that's amazing. So that's example number one. Example number two is India has been has, which is about now the India model. India model is a very different model. Indian government did two things which I really respect a lot. First is empowering the state governments or decentralizing the startup policies and frameworks, i.e., they made it by choice or by chance an election agenda across different states in India. And then, without saying it out, it is starting to become a competition between different states on who is breeding more startups. And because it became like competition, they are forcing themselves to identify what sectors they want to focus on, what technology they want to focus on. So instead of saying that we are breeding startups, every state is starting to craft out its own niche, which is just amazing, because the moment you start crafting out your niche, I, as a startup, know there is a niche state. If I want to build a deep tech startup, I need to go to Chennai. If I want to build a fintech startup, I need to go to Mumbai. If I want to build a SaaS platform, I need to go to Bangalore. If I'm building an EV startup, I need to go to Delhi. So because all these states or the city governments started encouraging their own niche, it started thriving the entire ecosystem. So both UAE and India have used different strategy, but they both are starting to work now and show results.
I love these points that you're making, Chirag. I mean, eternal competition. I mean, that's amazing. Even when we think about individuals like yourself, myself, I I compete best when it's eternal. When I'm competing with how I did yesterday, how I did last year, and things like that. That's just me personally. I know everyone works differently. Some people are better competing with others and whatnot. But like that eternal competition, when it's there, that's where we get self, that's eternal drive that keeps you moving and things like that. And seeing that even on a global scale, when it comes to international countries, setting out eternal competition, though obviously India at whole is going to be competing with the Silicon Valleys and the Londons and all these different places. But even setting up eternal competition, I think is very genius. Now, if I'm not mistaken, Indian government has set aside about 1 billion for startups and has released only 100 million, but and it must be invested in the next 2 to 3 years. Activities like that, it seems to be very encouraging for those who want to compete, for those who want to actually do something innovative within a country. So would you go into more details on that fund, and what inspired that, and how much impact have you seen it have on the ecosystem so far?
So there are different parts of the fund. There is a grant part of the fund, and there's a small amount of money that startups can apply and get a grant for. There is a funding part of it where the startups can get an equity from the government. There is a fund of fund approach where Indian government has nominated certain funds that can invest on behalf of government. And there is a corporate investment approach where Indian government has identified certain corporates which are also owned by the government to actually deploy that money. Now, the interesting part is, now it's a good part and a bad part. The good part is when government starts deploying money in the startup, it increases the trust in the technical capability of the startup. Almost always, not all. I will not say always. because generally government is very good in conducting technical due diligence, because more often than not they have access to the resources to review the work done by the startup on a very fast basis, and comment, or at least decide if it's running in the right direction. Will it lead to a new technical innovation, or is this bullshit? However, so that's a good side, but there's a bad side to the same thing. Now, the bad side is that the moment government gets involved in the startup funding, they, and I'm saying funding, not necessarily the grant, they want to have regular updates. They want to have a say on how startups progress. They want to, because if you think of it, if I am a government employee and I actually said yes to a startup and it fails, I will be held accountable for the government money. Now, because I want to protect myself, and I in front of my seniors, that I do not screw up government money, I will always play cautious. And even after the investment, I will be after the life of the startup founders to get updates, give them my point of view of how they should be doing it. And if they disagree with me, to be upset with them, chase them. And that sometimes can be very tiring to the startup founders. So the Indian government money is a double-edged sword. In some case, the reason they have not been able to deploy, because they have not figured out what are the right ways to deploying it. But at the same time, there are startups that I'm aware of that are very cautious of taking government money, because they don't want to be in a situation that they have to keep updating the government that this is what we're doing. And a lot of startups are a cash burn business for a while. Now, to explain to an Indian government employee, I am going to spend $7 to make a revenue of $5, it just does not make sense. And to anyone actually, but that's how the startups work in the beginning. And when you do that, so they might be okay at the time of investment, but more often than not, they will get cold feet. And because they will get cold feet, the money doesn't get deployed. So now there is an opportunity here. The opportunity is there's a massive amount of money that has not yet been deployed, which needs to be deployed in the next probably 2 to 3 years, as you rightly said. So either the government will change their model, i.e., invest more using fund of funds, where funds like us will come in picture, or the government will change their own investment model, where they will give more autonomy to the government employees or to the corporate teams when they are making investments. I am not fully aware at this point on what changes they will be making, but they do have budget. They do have the targets to deploy. So now the money is going to flow in soon, but the question is how and when, no one knows.
Okay. Now, speaking of that, kind of on those lines, I want to dive into valuation a little.
Let me first talk about the overall VC valuations or overall startup valuation, and then I will talk about a subset, which is a deep tech valuation, which is where we focus on. Now, when we talk about the overall valuation, if you talk about the US or the European market, and you open AngelList or any of the platforms, that may not be the right reflection of the entire community or the entire universe, but you will notice that at the idea stage or at a pre-seed stage of the startup founders are already talking about double-digit $1 million of the valuation. They're talking about how my company is $15 million because this will become $100 million and you will make a lot of money very soon. So you should invest in us. So the approach of coming up with a valuation is pretty much that at Series A, companies like mine are around $100 million, and I will reach there, and you will make 5 to 7 times money. So that's why you should invest. So it's a very top-down approach. Now, very often, or not always, a lot of Indian startups, when they start to go into the valuation, and I'm not saying it's a standard approach, but it's an approach that I have observed. The question that is often raised is, if I were to build a startup, something that you might be building already, how much is it going to cost me? So it's a very bottom-up approach of coming up with the valuation. Of course, they look at the top down as well, but the conversation also goes from bottom up. And the moment you go bottom up, you will realize that a lot of pre-seed startups, and a lot of them, but from where they stand and what they have achieved, most of them, everything that they have built can be built in $1 million. And whatever they are saying they can build, it can be built for another couple of $1 million. So because of that, the valuation numbers definitely come down the moment you start doing bottom-up valuation of these startups. So that's the overall approach difference. And because of this difference, as you rightly said, the US valuation tend to be a lot higher. And there's too much dry powder in the US and the European market right now, which makes the situation even a lot more complicated versus the Indian market. So that makes the valuation difference very apparent. Now, let me double click on the deep tech valuations. On a deep tech valuations, is completely acceptable in the European and the US market that a company has reached a Series B $100 million valuation with no revenue. It happens quite often, especially when we're talking about a deep tech space, because deep tech often requires 3 years to 7 years of R&D, especially if you're talking about biotech, health tech, med tech. These spaces, there is a 3 to 7 years of R&D that is required, and these are cash burn R&D. And if they get the output right, it's $1 billion business. So their technical readiness is there, but the market readiness is not there. And the same goes for drone manufacturing or anything. A lot of products, space tech, for example, they up till Series B, you are not making any money actually. And there's no clarity how and when you will make money in the space tech, biotech. So you have a high technical readiness. You have burnt up $100 million with still no clarity on how and when you will make money. And you are a Series B. However, when you talk about the Indian market, for a company to enter Series A, not always, but more often than not, if you don't have a revenue in sight, you will not be able to raise a Series A funding. And in the desperate attempt to get some funding for survival, a lot of deep tech startups reduce their valuations drastically, and they dilute a lot because they have no choice. And with all hand on heart, I feel a lot of deep tech founders take a massive pay cut. They're working on with zero salary for years, with no clarity when they will start making a salary. And all they have is equity in the game, unlike the US market where they start making the salary as well. Only because they know the valuation is not going to match up to the US standards. So the difference in the deep tech space is actually a lot more severe than you will see in the rest of the market landscape.
Well, before diving into a little bit of 8X Ventures, because I really want to hear more about like your investment thesis there, and any type of game you could give to startups that may be wanting to reach out and connect with you for some capital. But before that, I want to piggyback off of what you just said, or ask a question on that, to go a little bit deeper on the on you mentioned dry powder with deep tech, in the deep tech space. Can you expound on that just a little bit more?
Sure. So something I find it very fascinating is that, globally speaking, let's think about the deep tech ecosystem of how much money is being invested in the deep tech ecosystem. In 2020, $60 billion were invested in the deep tech ecosystem globally. Now, given the number of engineers that India has, given the number of healthcare staff people India has, and the number of startups India has, when I started doing research, my safest assumption was India must have at least 10% of that, because deep tech is a space where India has so many R&D centers right now where a lot of startups are doing research. So that was the assumption that I started with, that out of $60 billion, there should be at least $6 billion going into the Indian deep tech ecosystem. But I was shocked when I saw the number is $1.3 billion only to the Indian ecosystem. There's a massive, massive gap between the US, European, Chinese, and Indian ecosystem. And if you think of that, then I started looking at the number of unicorns that in the deep tech space that these countries are breeding. In the US, roughly 1/4 of the startups that are unicorn right now or becoming unicorn are deep tech startups. If you talk about Europe, about 21% of the startups in the unicorn space are deep tech startups. China is also getting there roughly. India is only 3% of the unicorn startups are deep tech startups. So when you look at these numbers of how much money is being deployed in India versus the rest of the world, there's a massive opportunity that is available for the VCs, especially in the deep tech space, to enter the Indian ecosystem and make a difference. However, making a difference here is not just about putting more money. To be able to understand the technical readiness level and the market readiness level of different startups, map them out, and have a sensible conversation on which ones we should be pushing further and which one we should not be pushing further, instead of jumping on and saying that, oh, this technology is disruptive, let's invest. So that thinking has to be fine-tuned a little bit to the Indian ecosystem, but there's a massive amount of money that can be made if it's done in the right way.
Okay. Well, that's some good insights, Chirag, and we could keep going deeper and deeper on all of these, and I think we should in a different podcast as well. But for now, if you don't mind giving us some details on 8X Ventures, a little bit about your thesis, what do you look for in founders, where are you currently investing? Just a quick synopsis, that'd be much appreciated.
Sure. So we are a deep tech focused venture capital firm. Our investment thesis is that we are about 70 to 80% focused in the Indian market, but about 20 to 30% focused on startups outside India. And as I said, India, because there's a massive opportunity, and also keeping a buffer for outside India, because we don't want to miss out on some great opportunities outside India as well, especially Singapore market. So, and Middle East as well, in case something comes out. So that's the fund that we have. We focus on seed to Series A stage of investments. And however, in the deep tech space, the way we define seed and the way we define Series A can change from startup to startup and can change from industry or function to function. So I would not say we'll follow, we are bound or forced to follow a standard VC definition. So if I have to rephrase, instead of seed to Series A, I would say we're comfortable doing from the POC stage to the post-revenue stage. That's where we come in, and we support the startup not just with the money, but also by providing our industry connections, all the necessary support, or access to the government resources that may be possible. So that's where we come in.
All right, Chirag, you're a very sharp guy, and I know you're constantly keeping up to date with what's going on, both international and domestically. What are you what tools are you currently using right now? Whether books, podcasts, what resources are you using right now to stay up to date with all things going on?
Honestly, the amount of research that comes on my table almost on a daily basis, it's more than I can anyways read. So I have not been able to follow any specific sources, which I should. You're right about it. Which I probably I should have a structure in place. There's one particular structure that I very closely follow. Yeah. I am a big fan of strategy consulting firms, because strategy consulting firms do amazing research. So I very closely follow the research done by McKinsey, BCG, and PwC, these three firms, because they do a lot of research on the deep tech ecosystem. They do a lot of research on the venture capital ecosystem. and their research is very data driven. I don't think it's plucked from the air. I've seen podcasts or articles. I really like your podcast because we're talking numbers and facts. But we have had, I have listened to the podcast or articles or medium.com articles where it's just a point of view. It's my point of view versus your point of view. It's not backed by facts. I love reading research reports. I love reading the reports published by Indian Institute of Technology, which is a great source of talent. I love reading reports by Indian Institute of Science, which is a great source for talent and to understand technology. That has been my key sources so far. But I'll make sure that I'll follow you and some other interesting podcasts in future.
Chirag, it's a pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much. Looking forward to another podcast. You're moving very fast and you're doing some tremendous work. So looking forward to keeping the conversation rolling. And I enjoy this. There's so much more we could talk about, man. But it just seems to never be enough time. But appreciate the time that you shared with us and the community so far.
And thanks to you. Thank you for giving me your time. Thank you.